The president of Lebanon called it the last chance. 48 hours later, Hezbollah's political bureau sent a letter to his office, in writing, stamped on official letterhead, telling him they would not accept a ceasefire that did not begin with a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from South Lebanon. 3,500. That is the death count in Lebanon since the 2nd of March. 1.1 million displaced. 20% of the country, an entire fifth of every man, woman, and child in Lebanon, sleeping somewhere that is not their home tonight. And in the 12 hours after the United States announced the ceasefire framework, Israeli warplanes struck 12 more towns in southern Lebanon. 12 dead Friday. 6 in Aida al-Shab, 3 in Yader, 2 in Qiyam, 1 more in a village called Na Khora that you have probably never heard of unless you are reading the UNIFIL Daily Situation Report. The mainstream press is calling this the Lebanon ceasefire crisis. That is the wrong frame. That frame turns a war into a diplomatic dispute. This is Professor Stephen, and what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is convince you that you have been looking at the wrong map. The Lebanon front is not a side story to the Iran war. It is the Iran war. It is a front Washington has spent 6 months trying to wall off from the main fight. Because admitting it is the same fight changes the cost calculation of everything the Trump administration has built its Middle East strategy on. Subscribe right now, because the next chapter of this war is not the one being telegraphed from the State Department briefing room. It is the one being negotiated in writing between a militia and the office of a president whose own army cannot enforce anything south of Beirut. Let's start with the document, because the document is the data point. On June 4, 2026, Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, the former commander of the Lebanese armed forces, a man who took office on the explicit American promise that the United States would help him reclaim sovereignty over South Lebanon, went on Lebanese state television and used the phrase, the last chance. That phrase is not casual. Aoun does not improvise. The phrase was scripted, approved by his political advisors, and pre-cleared with the American envoy. He was telling Hezbollah, in the polite language of Lebanese political theater, that if they did not accept the framework his American counterparts had just put on the table, he could no longer guarantee what came next. Hezbollah answered him the next morning, not through a press conference, not through Al-Manar, not through one of the Iranian-aligned outlets the West is used to mining for signals. They answered him through a formal letter delivered to the office of the president by a member of the political bureau. The letter is short. I am reading from the version that Lebanese journalist Hala Jaber published on her account, which she sourced from a presidential aide. The letter says, in essence, that Hezbollah will not consider any framework that does not begin, that is the operative word, with the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from South Lebanon, not concurrent with, not in exchange for, not contingent upon, begin with. Take a second on that sentence. The sequencing demand is the whole point. The Trump administration's framework, which was drafted with input from David Shanker at the Washington Institute and signed off by the American envoy Amos Hochstein's successor team at the State Department, is built on the assumption that withdrawal and disarmament happen simultaneously, in monitored phases, with UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, verifying compliance on both sides of the Latani River. Hezbollah just told the president of Lebanon, in writing, that they will not even open the conversation under those terms. The framework is dead. Aoun knows it is dead. The Americans know it is dead. The only people who do not know it is dead, apparently, are the editors of the wire services that ran Lebanon ceasefire holds as a headline on Friday morning while Israeli F-16s were hitting Yader. Here is the geography you need in your head, because the geography is the argument. Lebanon's southern border with Israel runs along what the United Nations calls the Blue Line. It is a demarcation set in 2000 when Israeli forces withdrew after 18 years of occupation. 25 kilometers north of the Blue Line, roughly, runs the Latani River. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, passed in August 2006 after the last major Israel-Hezbollah war, says that the zone between the Blue Line and the Latani is supposed to be free of armed groups other than UNIFIL and the Lebanese armed forces. In practice, Hezbollah has held that zone for 20 years. The towns Israel is striking right now, Aida al-Shab, Qiyam, Na Khora, Bint Jabal, are towns between the Blue Line and the Latani. The Trump framework asks Hezbollah to pull every fighter, every weapons cache, every rocket and anti-tank missile north of the Latani as part of the deal. The framework does not ask Israel to pull back of the blue line until that withdrawal is verified. Read that twice. The framework asks Hezbollah to move first. Hezbollah's letter says they will not move first. That is the entire dispute compressed into a 6-page document. I want to bring in the International Crisis Group here, because the ICG has been the most clear-eyed institution writing about South Lebanon for the last 15 years. Their senior Lebanon analyst, Heiko Wimmen, published a briefing on May 28th that I would put in front of every American diplomat working this file. Wimmen's argument, and I will paraphrase faithfully, is that Hezbollah's leadership, what is left of it after the cascade of decapitation strikes Israel conducted in late 2024, is operating under a constraint that Washington has consistently underestimated. The constraint is Hezbollah's own constituency, Underatom. The constraint is Hezbollah's own constituency. The Shia population of South Lebanon and the southern suburbs of Beirut, the Dahieh, has absorbed 8 months of bombing, displacement, and house-to-house demolition. Returning to those villages without the Israeli army leaving first is, in the ICG's framing, politically impossible for any Hezbollah leadership that wishes to remain a Lebanese political actor. The militia cannot ask its base to come home to a South Lebanon still occupied by Merkava tanks. It would end Hezbollah as a domestic political force more decisively than anything Israel has done militarily. So when the headlines say Hezbollah is rejecting the ceasefire, they are framing this as defiance. It is not defiance. It is the structural arithmetic of running a militia that is also a political party that is also a social services network for a quarter of the Lebanese population. There is no Hezbollah without those villages. There is no return to those villages while Israel sits on the ridgelines above them, and there is no Trump framework that does not ask Hezbollah to accept exactly that geometry first. Now let me bring Iran into this, because this is where the Second Front argument has to be made explicitly. Hezbollah was founded in 1982 with direct material support from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. 44 years later, that umbilical cord has not been severed, even after the cascade of Israeli strikes on Iranian logistics nodes in Syria over the past 2 years. The Foundation for Defensive Democracies estimates, and FDD has been hawkish on Iran for 2 decades, so this is not a sympathetic source, that Hezbollah still receives somewhere between $700 million and $1 billion a year in direct Iranian support. The Treasury Department's Operation Sharp Pencil designations for March 2026 named 11 Iranian individuals and 4 front companies routing money through Beirut. The money is still moving. The weapons pipeline through Syria is degraded but not closed. And the political coordination, the part nobody can sanction, is intact. What that means in plain English is that when Hezbollah's political bureau decides not to accept a ceasefire framework, that decision is not made independently of Tehran. It does not have to be made by Tehran in order to be coordinated with Tehran. Iran's Supreme National Security Council does not need to send a fax. The strategic logic is shared because the strategic interest is shared. Tehran's interest is in keeping the Israel-Lebanon front active for as long as the United States is pressing Iran on Hormuz, because every American diplomatic asset that has to be committed to the Lebanon file is one not available for the Iran file. The second front is not metaphor. The second front is fungibility. American attention is fungible. American envoy time is fungible. American credibility, the thing that supposedly underwrites the security order in this region, is the most fungible of all. Let me catch myself here because I do not want to oversell this. The honest answer is that Hezbollah's actual military capability after the 18 months of war it has just been through is genuinely unclear. And I have read 3 predictions of Hezbollah's imminent collapse from very serious analysts in the last calendar year, and all 3 of them have been wrong. Andrew Tabler at the Washington Institute predicted in November 2024 that Hezbollah's command structure was so degraded it could not function as a coherent military organization through 2025. It is now June 2026, and Hezbollah is still able to coordinate enough rocket fire to force the evacuation of northern Israeli towns 3 nights a week. Hanan Gadar at WinePeb predicted in February that the organization would split internally between a political wing willing to disarm and a military wing committed to resistance. There is no public evidence of that split. The RAND Corporation's December 2024 assessment estimated Hezbollah's missile inventory at fewer than 30,000 systems, down from a pre-war estimate of 150,000. The Israeli Air Force's own internal assessments, which Haaretz reported on April 11th, now put Hezbollah's residual inventory at between 40,000 and 60,000, meaning either the original 150,000 number was inflated, or the destruction was less complete than claimed, or both. I do not know which of those three is right. Anybody telling you they do know is selling you something. What I can tell you with confidence is that Hezbollah retains enough capability to make the cost of Israeli occupation of South Lebanon unsustainable over months, not weeks. Which means the Israeli posture, strike, hold ridgelines, refuse to withdraw until Hezbollah moves first, is itself politically unsustainable for the Netanyahu government if it stretches into the autumn. We are watching two organizations, both depleted, both refusing to move first, both retreated, both refusing to move first, both running out of the political runway they need to compromise. That is what makes this dangerous. I want to bring this home to your wallet for a minute, because the part of this story that lands in American grocery carts is not obvious from the headlines. The Iran-Lebanon-Israel triangle is not just a humanitarian story. It is an oil price story, and an oil price story is, for Americans, a gasoline story and a grocery story. Goldman Sachs published a working paper in late May, estimating that the secondary spike risk from a direct Israel-Iran military exchange, meaning Iran responding to a Lebanon escalation by hitting Israeli or American assets in the Gulf directly, would add another $15 to $22 per barrel to Brent crude on top of the war premium that is already baked into the price. Brent is currently sitting at $118. A secondary spike puts it at $135 to $140. At the pump, that is roughly another 40 cents on top of the $1.16 you have already absorbed since February. If you drive 12,000 miles a year in a car that gets 25 miles to the gallon, that secondary spike alone, just the new component, costs you an additional $192 over 12 months. And that is just gasoline. Diesel prices flow to trucking. Trucking flows to grocery shelves. The bag of chicken thighs you were paying $9 for this week becomes the bag you pay $10.50 for in October, and you will be told it is because of input costs. The input cost is a Hezbollah letter sent to a Lebanese president on June 5th. There is also a U.S. troop exposure dimension you do not hear about often enough. The Pentagon's posture statement, the most recent unclassified version, puts current American force levels across CENTCOM's area of operations at somewhere north of 50,000 personnel. That includes the carrier strike groups in the Eastern Med and the Arabian Sea, the personnel rotating through Al Udeid in Qatar and Al Dhafra in the UAE, the troops in Iraq and Syria, the 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama. 50,000. The Pentagon's Force Protection Threat Assessment, which Politico reported on May 31st, has been elevated to imminent for U.S. personnel in Iraq and eastern Syria specifically. Imminent is the highest threat level the Pentagon uses below active engagement. It is the level we were at the week before the Soleimani strike in January 2020. It is not a level you stay at indefinitely. Something either de-escalates or something happens, and the trigger that nobody in the briefings will name out loud, but which everybody in the building is watching, is whether the Lebanon front becomes the front that drags in Iranian Quds Force assets in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in ways that put American kids on bases inside the kill envelope of weapons they cannot reliably intercept. Here's the case for it mattering, stated as plainly as I can. The Trump administration came into office in January promising a Middle East strategy organized around three pillars: a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, a normalization track between Israel and the remaining Gulf holdouts, and the eventual delegation of regional security to a coalition of GCC states with a smaller American footprint. The Lebanon ceasefire was supposed to be the proof of concept for that third pillar. It was supposed to demonstrate that the United States could broker a stable cessation of hostilities, hand off enforcement to a combination of UNIFIL and the Lebanese armed forces, and pull American attention back to the Iran file. Hezbollah's June 5th letter blows the proof of concept apart. If the United States cannot deliver a Lebanon ceasefire, it cannot deliver a Gaza ceasefire. It cannot anchor a Saudi-Israel normalization deal, and it cannot credibly promise the Gulf states a regional security architecture that does not depend on permanent American forward deployment. Every other pillar of the strategy is contingent on this one working, and this one is not working. And here's the case for it mattering less than the headlines will suggest. Hezbollah has issued maximalist opening positions before that turned into negotiated settlements 18 months later. The August 2006 ceasefire, the one that produced UN SCR 1701 in the first place, started with Hezbollah refusing any disarmament whatsoever. The framework that was eventually signed included implicit disarmament provisions that everybody pretended to accept and nobody enforced for 2 decades. There is a version of this story where the June 5th letter is the opening move in a 6-month negotiation that ends with a face-saving framework Israel can live with and Hezbollah can survive politically. The ICG's women actually leans this way in his briefing. He thinks there is a 35 to 45% chance of a negotiated outcome by November if both sides feel enough domestic political pressure. I find his case credible, and I want you to hold it in your head as the counter case to mine. What I think the honest analyst has to acknowledge is that we are inside a window where the structural pressures point toward continued escalation, and the conjunctural pressures, meaning the actual political calendars in Washington, in Jerusalem, in Beirut, and in Tehran, could swing it either way over the next 90 days. The window matters because it is short. The longer Hezbollah's letter sits on Aoun's desk without an American response, the more it ossifies into a stated position rather than an opening bid. Diplomatic negotiations have a shelf life. Aoun's last chance framing was a shelf life signal. Let me bring it back to ground, to the instruments you can actually watch over the next month, because I would rather give you things to monitor than predictions to bet against. Watch the UNIFIL daily situation reports. They are public, they are published in English. They list every blue line violation on both sides, and they are the most reliable real-time indicator of whether the strikes are continuing, accelerating, or pausing. Watch the Lebanese pound. It is currently trading at roughly 89,000 to the dollar on the parallel market, down from 48,000 pre-war. If the pound breaks 100,000 in the next 30 days, that is the Lebanese economy pricing in a longer war. Watch what the Saudis say publicly versus what they do quietly. Riyadh has been the financial backstop for the Aoun government since January. If Saudi rhetoric on Hezbollah hardens publicly, but the financial support continues quietly, that tells you the Saudis still believe a negotiated outcome is possible. If the financial support starts to wobble, the negotiation window is closing. Watch the price of Brent crude on the Friday close in 3 weeks. If it has crossed 125, the secondary spike has begun. And watch what the U.S. Navy does with the Eisenhower Carrier Group. It is currently in the Arabian Sea. If it gets ordered to the Eastern Med, you are watching escalation move from analytical to operational. I want to leave you with the question I keep coming back to because I do not have a clean answer to it, and I would rather hand it to you honestly than pretend I do. If the second front of a war is the front that nobody in Washington wants to admit is part of the same war, because admitting it would force a reckoning with how much of the original strategy has already failed, then what exactly is the mechanism by which this ends? Wars end when both sides accept they cannot improve their position by continuing to fight. Neither side here is yet at that point. The administration that brokered the framework cannot admit the framework has failed without admitting the larger strategy has failed. The militia that wrote the letter cannot move first without dissolving its own political base. The army occupying the ridgelines cannot withdraw without conceding the deterrence theory that justifies the occupation. 3 deadlocks. 1 front. 1 letter. 3,500 dead so far. 1.1 million people somewhere that is not home tonight. And a clock running on a ceasefire that already, quietly, in the language only the people writing it know how to read, has died. This is Professor Stephen. I'll see you in the next one.